My name's Wendy Fenton, and I'm the coordinator of the Humanitarian Practice Network here at ODI. And I'd like to welcome you and everyone who's watching online today to the launch of More Than Just Luck. I think you've all got copies of the report on your chair. And this is a new report by ALNAP and ELRA's Humanitarian Innovation Fund. So we're delighted to be launching this today. In addition, we're also taking the opportunity to launch the current edition of the Humanitarian Exchange, which is also focused on humanitarian innovation. And you should have copies of that on your chair as well. I think we all know that there's actually very little research and documentation around how humanitarian innovation actually happens. I mean, how are ideas generated? You know, how do they get put into practice and scaled up? And if an innovation doesn't actually work or it isn't scaled up, but we still learn something from it, is it still considered a failure? These are all questions, I think, that ALNAP and HIF have been trying to look at in this study. And the study suggests that while luck plays some role in innovation, there are actions or aid organizations can take to actually increase the chances that their innovations will be successful. And the report analyzes the findings from an examination of innovation processes used in 15 case studies to try to identify the factors that contribute to successful innovation management in humanitarian settings. And the latest edition of the Exchange, which I just showed you, also focuses on innovation in the humanitarian sector. And it highlights the rising interest in funding for innovation, as well as what more needs to be done to actually improve the evidence base, to relocate capacity from headquarters into field locations and into different sorts of populations, affected people, for example, and the need to develop further guidance. The articles cover a whole range of topics, from crowdsource mapping during the Nepal earthquake response to urban microfinance programming in Uganda run by refugees. So a wide range of topics, and I urge you to look at both publications. But today, we're bringing together an innovator, an innovation fund manager, a researcher, and a humanitarian leader, and to reflect on the report and the issues raised in the exchange from their own perspectives and experience. And before I introduce the panel, though, I wanted to do a bit of housekeeping. So could I ask that you put your phones on silent, but do tweet if you want to, and the hashtag is innovateaid. If the fire alarm rings, please leave the room and go past reception and out the front door. And also, if you could please hold your comments and questions until the discussion that we're going to have later on in the event. And I'd also like to remind you that the event is being streamed live online. As I said, we've got 350 people with us today. And we'll be posting a video of the event on the ODI website within a few days' time. So now, for our distinguished panel of speakers, we're delighted to have with us today, on my immediate right, Dr. Jamila Mahmood, the Undersecretary General for Partnerships at the IFRC. Prior to joining the IFRC, Jamila was the chief of the World Humanitarian Summit Secretariat at the UN in New York, and I think probably most of you in the room and online know her. She's also the founder of Mercy Malaysia, which she led from 1999 until 2009. Jamila's held many board positions in NGOs and INGOs, including the chair of the Humanitarian Innovation Fund's grants panel. And she's the recipient of numerous national and international awards for her contributions to civil society and her work in support of marginalized communities. So we're very happy that you could join us today, Jamila. And on our far right is Alice Obrecht. Alice is a research fellow at ALNAP, and she's currently leading ALNAP's work streams on innovation and effectiveness. And she is the main author of the report, along with Alexandra Warner. Alexandra, are you in the room? There she is at the back. So Alice, as I said, she's a lead researcher on the study, and which looks at the successful humanitarian innovation. And she's the lead author of the case studies and also the synthesis report, which we're looking at today. And on my left, immediate left, is Kim Scriven. And in addition to being the co-editor of this edition of the Humanitarian Exchange, Kim is the manager of ELRA's Humanitarian Innovation Fund. which is a grant-making fund that supports organizations working in countries and regions facing humanitarian challenges to help them test and share innovations. And he researched and wrote on innovation in his previous role at ALNAP and has been a key player in driving the innovation agenda in the lead up to the World Humanitarian Summit. So we're very happy that Kim is with us today, too. And last but not least, on my far left is Rebecca Petrus. And Rebecca is the director of Translators Without Borders. And this is an international NGO that assists in translating more than 8 million, is it? 8 million words per year for NGOs into local languages. Rebecca ran the Words of Relief program, which translated health materials into local dialects during the Ebola crisis in West Africa. Words of Relief is featured in ALNAP and the Humanitarian Innovation Fund's research, as well as in a previous edition of the Humanitarian Exchange magazine, number 64, which focused on the Ebola crisis. So we're now going to begin with a presentation from Alice on the study findings, and then Kim is going to also reflect on the study findings, but also on the key themes and issues addressed in the exchange articles. And following that, we're going to have a short panel discussion. Then I'll open up the floor for questions and comments from the audience. Right, Alice.
Great. Thank you so much, Wendy. So as indicated by the extreme amount of interest in the event today, it seems that humanitarian innovation has never been more popular. Also, wouldn't it be great for me to have technological problems on an innovation talk? Great, thank you. So humanitarian innovation has perhaps never been more popular, and yet it seems when we look at the amount of attention and energy that's been dedicated to humanitarian innovation, there's still a huge amount or lack of clarity around some pretty fundamental issues. So it seems we still don't really understand what innovation management is within the humanitarian sector. We don't know what success looks like, and we don't know how to achieve it. So in order to address some of these issues and try to build the evidence base for humanitarian innovation, ALNAP has been engaged in a 2-year research partnership with ELRA's Humanitarian Innovation Fund to carry out 15 case studies on the innovation processes funded by the HIF. We've synthesized the findings from those case studies in the report that's being launched today, and we're trying to answer this question of which factors contribute to successful innovation management in humanitarian settings in that report. So we're really focused in this research on the innovation process, not broader innovation programs at the organizational level or the broader innovation ecosystem within the humanitarian system. And we're also really directing this research at the perspective of the innovation manager, hoping to provide concrete and relevant findings for innovation managers in humanitarian settings. So the first question that the report looks at is, what is humanitarian innovation? Because outside the innovation bubble within the humanitarian system, there's still some questions from managers about, is innovation actually different from what I'm currently doing? Is it different from standard humanitarian programming, and how? And to explore this question, we talked to innovation managers about their experiences in the innovation process and how it was different or similar to their experiences managing other humanitarian programs, what you might consider standard or typical programs in the humanitarian sector. And what we found from that, and also looking across the case studies at commonalities, is that humanitarian innovation is essentially about trying to do something differently at a system or sector-wide level in order to bring about an improvement in humanitarian action. So innovation isn't simply about new ideas, coming up with new inventions or totally novel approaches. In fact, many of the innovations we looked at took ideas that came from outside the humanitarian system and adapted them for a new problem or humanitarian purpose, or tried to seize an opportunity for humanitarian use. So it's not just about novelty. However, it is about trying to adapt these ideas that exist outside the humanitarian context, and because innovators are doing things differently to seek improvement, there is a higher degree of uncertainty in their process when compared to standard humanitarian programming. So you have an idea for improvement, but you don't really know if it's going to work or not. That's going to take a lot of testing and revision. And so we've come to understand humanitarian innovation essentially as an iterative process that is identifying, adjusting, and diffusing ideas for improving humanitarian action. So if innovation is an iterative process of continuous revision and testing. How do we understand what success looks like? And here there's been a surprising lack of attention to trying to understand what successful innovation means. Probably this is due to the challenge of trying to incorporate concepts of acceptable failure within our understanding of successful innovation, right? So if you have an iterative process where innovating teams are trying out ideas, but they don't know whether or not they're going to work, of course there's going to be some degree of failure that's inherent or intrinsic to that process. So we need to understand what good failure looks like and give room to that concept within our understanding of successful innovation. And we also crucially need to be able to decide or determine when a given project is a good fail and when it's simply the result of bad management practices. When is it a bad fail? So what's the difference between good failure and bad failure in an innovation process? So in order to address this in the report and also in an article that's included in the HPN Exchange magazine, we decided to define 3 criteria for success in innovation. So the first criteria for success is adoption, and this is probably what most people think of when they think of successful innovation. You bring in a new idea for improvement, it has demonstrated results, and then it's widely diffused and widely adopted. But not all innovations might achieve wide adoption. Why? Because even though they offer an improvement, there are certain political barriers and blockages within the system or bad incentives that prevent wider adoption from taking place. Cash-based programming of a few years ago might be an example of one of these innovations. But in these cases, we still want to leave room for considering innovations to be successful if they're delivering a real, tangible improvement to humanitarian action. So the second criteria for success is improved solution. Is the innovation producing a measurable and comparable improvement for humanitarian action? But you still might have an innovation process that doesn't even achieve an improved solution. And these are the cases that we tend to think of as good fails. These are innovation processes where innovating teams have an idea, they try to test it out and build up a proof of concept, and it turns out that the original idea just doesn't work the way it was expected. So in these cases, we want to understand success in terms of the learning and evidence that's being generated by the innovating team so that that same team or other teams and organizations can build on that experience and eventually develop an effective innovation. So then what contributes to these 3, to the success of an innovation process in achieving these 3 criteria? The report will go into a lot more detail than I'm able to today, but just to give you a broad picture of how we understood the successful innovation process. Successful innovating teams tend to answer 5 different questions throughout the innovation process, each of these questions corresponding to a different stage in the innovation process. So starting with recognizing a problem or an opportunity for improving humanitarian action, the innovating team asks, what is that problem or opportunity? And then moves through to asking, what is the potential idea for improvement? How can this idea work? Does the idea work through testing and implementation? And then finally, how can wider ownership for this improvement be achieved through diffusion? We found that these often do not occur in a linear fashion, but rather innovating teams tend to engage in these activities in an overlapping fashion. They also tend to go back to the same stage or question multiple times within the same innovation process due to its iterative nature. We also used a set of hypotheses to structure our research, and from the findings from those hypotheses, we've identified 7 success factors for humanitarian innovation, which are described in the report. And in particular, we discussed the ways in which these success factors emerge across the 5 stages of innovation. But I'd just like to touch on 2 themes from this report that I think would be interesting and relevant for our discussion this afternoon. The first one being on this question of what is the value or contribution of humanitarian innovation to broader humanitarian performance and action. There's quite a lot of debate that rages on about the potential contributions of innovation. From the perspective of this research, what we found consistently across the case studies was that innovating teams are making substantial contributions to building the evidence base for humanitarian performance. And it's great to have Rebecca Petrus on the panel here today, because Words of Relief was one of several excellent examples we saw where innovating teams were generating comparative evidence to demonstrate the improvement that was being brought forward by their innovation. But there's an interesting finding here, because in order to show that an innovation offers an improvement over current practice, innovating teams need two types of information. They need to be generating evidence on how their own innovation is performing, but they also need some high-quality baseline data on how current interventions and activities are performing. And it was quite surprising to us on the research team to see how many times innovating teams had to go out and find or generate that high-quality baseline data themselves, because existing data did not exist. So that points us to the role that innovating teams can play in not only improving humanitarian action through their innovations, but also improving our understanding of how we're doing right now with our current interventions. The second point I wanted to touch on is this role and importance of looking at innovation management, which I think Kim is also going to discuss. There are a couple of reasons why it's important that we spend more time and effort trying to understand the particular practices and tools that are needed for good innovation management. The first has to do with risk. There's a lot of questions around risk and harm that arise whenever we think about whether or not humanitarians should be engaging in innovation. And indeed, managing risk was one of the success factors we found in our research. But again, there was a bit of a surprise here. We looked at the role of having structured formal risk assessments at the beginning of an innovation process and its contribution to success, and found that these structured risk assessments didn't seem to have a strong contribution to success. Instead, there were three elements of effective risk management approaches that we saw in innovating teams. The first element was identifying the different parties or stakeholders that could be harmed by an innovation or negatively affected by an innovation, developing effective mitigation strategies to deal with these, and then third, and most importantly actually, it was about creating an open and flexible process so that members of an innovating team could remain open to identifying and responding to new risks as they emerge throughout the process. But all of this points to the need for better tools and approaches that can help innovation managers and innovating teams manage the uncertainty of their process in a more ethical way, rather than focusing too much on front-loading risk assessment at the beginning of the process. Building on this, we also found that organizing and structuring an innovation process was really critical to success, but mainly when innovating teams recognized that innovation is different from standard programming and did not try to simply apply standard program management approaches to an innovation process. However, this is an area where humanitarians still don't have the tools or best practice knowledge to guide them, and points to the importance of looking at innovation management as a distinct practice from standard programming management. And then finally, there were a number of soft factors for success that emerged from the research. One of the key examples of this is, again, not to embarrass Rebecca too much, but the passion and the dedication of the leads on these innovation projects who really drove innovation through their organization and also externally to the sector. Also, looking at the trust that was built up in relationships over time seemed to be one of these soft factors for successful innovation. And at first glance, it seems that these soft factors are really a matter of luck or chance, right? So it just happened to be that it was the right person in the right place at the right time making this innovation work. But when you look a bit more closely, we found that actually humanitarian innovation is more than just luck, hence the title of our report. There are clear choices that organizations can make to improve their culture for innovation, to retain and reward passionate, forward-thinking staff, and to support and cultivate strong relationships and partnerships, including with actors outside the traditional humanitarian system. And as humanitarian crises demand more from humanitarian organizations and others, the responsibility to make these choices becomes ever more important. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you very much. I'm going to move straight over to Kim in the interest of time. Kim?
Great. Thanks, Wendy. First of all, I wanted to say it's a real pleasure to be here and exciting to have a real community of people who are interested in innovation and change in the system. In addition to the rich body of evidence that Alice has just been talking us through, we've got the 15 case studies in the Humanitarian Exchange, And I think we've really got a growing set of examples that we can draw on and learn from about innovation in the system. I think we're doubtless going to be exploring and touching upon the challenges and inhibitors to innovation in the system. So I think it's really important to start by remembering and celebrating some of these innovations that are already improving the lives of people affected by crises and disasters. From the use of 3D printing to try and shorten supply chains right to the field level, to new models for insurance that shift risk away from humanitarian actors, we've got a really inspiring range of examples of what's possible. And I think it's important to build this community and consolidate this practice as we move forward. I'm not going to repeat what Alice has already said, but I do urge you to pick up the case studies that feed into the report, because they're really drawing on the experiences of the HIF over the last 5 or 6 years. And it's a really rich body of information, both on specific innovations and on innovation more generally. I did want to make 3 points, though, drawing on Alice's work, which I think are really instructive. The first is, as Alex and Alessandra point out in the report, we're really moving from an understanding of innovation as a noun, as innovations that we identify in the system, to a verb, to something that we do. And I think that that's really important as we seek to see it as something that can be initiated, supported, and managed. Secondly, I wanted to touch upon the inherently linked piece around innovation and evidence that's particular to the humanitarian system. Given our system's particular weakness when it comes to encouraging the generation of evidence, this has been one of the most challenging areas for the HIF, and I think that it's true to say that our partners have not always been able, and in some cases perhaps not willing, to produce evidence around what's working and what's not. And I think this reflects a systemic problem, but the inner system which lacks the traditional feedback loops and incentive structures for innovation, that role of evidence is particularly important. This is a problem, but I think there's also a silver lining here, that is, as we're generating evidence around innovations, we're also raising our knowledge base around the system more generally, particularly through the generation of baselines, but also from learning around where innovations aren't working. And again, this links to perhaps the fundamental rationale for us being here today, that we are moving from describing what we mean by innovation in humanitarian practice to a conversation about how it can be supported and actively managed. And this, for me, is crucial as we seek to move beyond the not inconsiderable hype that has been generated around the innovation agenda to a consolidated and cohesive set of practices to help us improve innovation management. I'm really looking forward to taking this work forward with ALNAP and to rolling it out with some of the projects that we're funding and learning more from it. I think, though, at this juncture, it's important to step back and to appraise the effects of this increased attention, interest, hype around innovation that I think we've all noticed in the last few years. And it's something that I think the range of views expressed in the humanitarian exchange really contribute to. It seems to me that this interest in innovation speaks to a number of trends in humanitarian aid: the desire to build links with the private sector, the desire to do more with less, and the desire to be more contextually relevant. But more simply for me, it's a consequence of a genuine desire to improve how we help those in need, repeatedly banging up against how the system's perverse incentives and inability to reform. And so the prospect of innovation offers hope in new solutions, new partnerships, and new routes to change. But as innovation becomes mainstreamed into agencies and is captured by bureaucracies, as they seek to sustain themselves, there's a real risk of fatigue and disillusionment with innovation. And I think, despite my involvement with the WHS, I've been quite open about the irony of that process, including an innovation theme. I don't have an immediate or compelling solution to this, but I would say that that if incumbent actors don't meaningfully deliver on some of the areas of change we're all aware of, they will be disrupted by more radical actors at the periphery of the system, with both positive and negative consequences. And I think perhaps we're already beginning to see that. If the 3D printers that I mentioned at the start of my talk, along with other technologies, are used to disrupt supply chains, rendering them obsolete, or if the provision of insurance products means that markets can facilitate response, this will change the very nature of the system. And so where does that leave us, those of us advocating for innovation? We need to recognise that we can't innovate our way out of essentially political problems, and be humble about this. And I think the work that the HIF's been doing on gender-based violence in emergencies in partnership with the Swedish government has been really instructive to me personally around how engaging with some of those problems through an innovation lens is particularly challenging. But we need to push the boundaries in demonstrating what innovation can do. And I've got three things that I think are incumbent upon us to do. The first is investing significantly in processes that engage affected people. I think we've been weak on this, frankly, and it's one of the most difficult things to do. But we need to talk to people and engage with them around innovations that they see as important over the long term. And this will require funding to be localised alongside innovation capacities, for example, through local labs and similar such initiatives. Secondly, we need to deliver on promises about change at scale by working to grow those good practices that are emerging. This is true particularly of innovations in the HIF portfolio, but also beyond. How do we grow what works? How do we aggregate beyond individual pilots? And this is a bit of a watch this space as well, because we're going to be launching some work in the Humanitarian Innovation Fund over the next couple of weeks, which will seek to lay out how we see those pathways to scale emerging. And finally, and perhaps most challengingly, to achieve these two goals, we need to be more prepared to engage strategically with the political economy of the aid sector, to understand those systemic blocks, broken feedback loops, and the competing incentives of different actors, to understand how they impact upon innovation, but also to more clearly understand what innovation can and cannot do. When I was looking through my notes to write the piece in Humanitarian Exchange, I came across a link that I'd saved to an Economist article from 2007 exploring how technology is transforming humanitarian relief. And it recounted the story of a Mr. Soccer who was in Dadaab refugee camp, who went online and found the mobile phone numbers of UN staff in Nairobi and London and sent them a message saying, "You must help." And I think perhaps what the last 9 years has shown us is that while technology and innovation will make acts like Mr. Soccer's more common, we're naive to think that alone they will be sufficient to deliver meaningful change in the wider aid system. And it's imperative of us not to gloss over that fact, even when we celebrate our successes.
Thank you, Ken. Okay, I think those were both very thought-provoking introductions, and I now want to pose a few questions to our panelists before we open up the floor to the rest of you. Rebecca, I wanted to start with you, if that's all right. As we said earlier, you're the director of Translators Without Borders, which use the HIF funding to set up Words of Relief. Mm-hmm. And it's an initiative providing local language translation services to NGOs and UN agencies during humanitarian responses. Can you tell us which of the study's findings most resonate with your experience as an innovator?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. We created Words of Relief with an understanding of a real need in terms of communicating with communities in the right language. And spent a lot of time trying to understand that need before we went to a process of innovation and creating something that we thought would work. In fact, we looked at a lot of things that we didn't think would work. We questioned it. We discussed it internally and externally. We talked to a lot of players in Haiti to understand what it was that we could do, what we could provide that would be useful. And I think the most important things for us once we began the process of innovation with Words of Relief was, first of all, the flexibility, the iterative approach, the ability to feel like we could throw things at the wall and try them and go, oh, that didn't work, and sort of go the other direction, and really having the space to do that, which for us was a really big deal with the HIF, because we felt like the failures would help us with the success. And so when we first piloted it, we tried some things that we ended up not using when we took it further. So that flexibility, that ability to be creative was really important. I think the second thing is definitely the focus on evidence and impact. We were bringing in an innovation that we did not, that we were talking to humanitarian sector that they had not really thought of before, the people we were talking to. When you bring it up to folks, they were like, well, that certainly makes sense. But you really, really had to sell it. And I come from the private sector. The humanitarian sector is new for me as of 2010. And before that, when I was in the private sector, I mean, evidence and, proving your innovation, like, that's just a given. And so it was something that it surprised me that we shouldn't, that that it wasn't a given that we had to do that. So we spent a lot of time trying to show the impact of the innovation that we did. And that work that we have done has helped us tremendously in advocating for the innovation and in building the uptake of and diffusing it further. I think those are the two.
Okay, great, thank you. So having that flexibility and building the evidence base and really having to prove
Yeah.
it were most important. Jamila, if I can turn to you now. So you've been working in innovation or on innovation for a long time now, when you were at the Humanitarian Futures Program at King's and in your earlier work at Mercy Malaysia. So I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about how the conversation around innovation has changed since you started working on this.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Wendy, and thanks, ALNAP, for inviting me. It's so great to be back and also to meet all my old friends at the HIF and ELRA. So I think, first of all, I'm really proud to see this report because I recognize, most of them because we had to fight over them on the ground panel to decide who was getting what. So it's great. I think, innovation, as I was sitting and listening here, I was saying that how many languages actually have innovation in them? And I was thinking that it's really hard for me, even in my own, mother tongue, to think of a word such as innovation. So really, in the last 5 years, there's been an explosion of a discussion on innovation, whereas from time, people have been innovating to survive, and cultures have had innovations because it's part and parcel of the evolution of mankind to be innovative. So I think, it's great in the last 5 years in the humanitarian sector, which is always playing catch up, as Rebecca has pointed out. We're beginning to now be more sophisticated in addressing this. And I think the reality is that innovation itself is not going to solve all the problems. It's the mindset that things have to keep changing for us to be better at what we do, because everything else around us is changing as well. And that's really critical. What's been great, though, is that, because of this drive towards highlighting innovation through HIF, through all the other platforms, through the UN, through the NGOs, through the World Humanitarian Summit, you can be quite critical about why it's a silo on its own, but you know what? It raised the opportunities for partnerships, for dialogue that maybe wouldn't have happened. So I think that's great. But the realization, and we realized this as well on the HIF panel, that for us to be really, truly true to the cause, I keep thinking that if problems are universal, solutions are shareable. But not all problems are universal. Some problems are quite unique. And if you look at local communities, they have their own sets of problems and they have their own sets of solutions. I don't think we engage enough in actually trying to identify the problems from a community perspective and actually listening to them to think what their solutions are, so that if there is a need to scale up those solutions, then we can maybe accompany them to do that, and then bringing the ideas from the innovation world, so to speak. So I think we've got to do a lot more of that listening, a lot more of that engagement, and really, diversifying the way we bring innovation to scale from bottom up. I know it sounds very cliche and, the whole rhetoric of bottom up, but we really need it. Now, I also think that we need to look at customization of innovation. What is really required for different communities? Because sometimes there are some innovations that really don't need to take to scale. But what's important, I think, is, do we live in a world now that has enough risk appetite? If we really want to be innovative, are the people who are funding, innovative processes allowing us to fail? Because if you look at these, private sector or the pharmaceutical industry or the health industry, you can get these innovations, these inventions, only because there's so much investment in research and development, innovation, to only get success in a small critical number. So I think, it's getting there. I just hope that innovation doesn't become a silo in itself, that innovation really becomes, something that we do naturally and not something that is an add-on. So I think that's a big thing that we should try and drive towards. Yeah.
So it needs to be integrated across our whole approach. Thanks, Jamila. Both the magazine and the report outline the importance of collaboration to successful innovation, and they both also highlight how actors from outside the humanitarian sector can drive innovation within the sector. And so I'm just wondering, Rebecca, what role have partnerships played in the development of Words of Relief?
Oh, it's absolutely key. We created partnerships before we had the innovation correct, because you can't create something like a translation network that's going to really improve communications in a silo. And I'm this small organization from the U.S., and I couldn't possibly do what I want to do, what I really was trying to do without collaboration. We collaborated both in the public sector and the private sector, in the humanitarian sector and the private sector. One of our biggest collaborators has been Microsoft. We use Microsoft and they use us to improve the technologies that help us with our network and that also help them in some way. But we are always innovating to make sure that we're for our end goal, using Microsoft, working with them, using the R&D. I mean, they have so much R&D that it's crazy not to get those ideas and that thinking when you're trying to create something. I can't tell you the discussions I've had with people in Microsoft who can just sort of help me solve a problem that I didn't even really understand at all. So that collaboration has been critical. We've also collaborated with Google. We've collaborated with Facebook. We talk to everyone. And then in the humanitarian sector, from our standpoint, for me that's my market, and so I need to make sure that when they're telling me that this innovation isn't going to work in a certain way, or we're talking to a local group in Nairobi and it doesn't make sense for them, that we're really listening. We've collaborated both on the local level in Kenya. We collaborated in the local level with a group that does work in Somalia and understood that what they needed was actually quite different than what they needed in Kenya. So that sort of just listening, I think listening has been really, really important.
What are some of the? Partnerships, require investment, and they and they don't come without challenges. And so, what sorts of challenges did you face in working in some of these partnerships?
A lot. Certainly, obviously funding, but on the private sector side of things, we did receive funding from several donors, including Microsoft. So that helped us a lot. That enhanced our funding from HIF. So that did help us a lot. Working with private and humanitarian sector is very difficult in some regards. I don't know how familiar you are with working with the tech industry, but they sort of can sit in Silicon Valley and just basically think they have all the solutions, and they're wonderful, wonderful innovators. But you have to bring the two together constantly. When someone says to you, well, we'll just give everybody on the shore in Greece tablets and everything will be fine. And you're like, how is that going to work? And so sort of having that local view, and I really believe you need the local view, but also the global view. And when you have that global view and you can really use that research and that R&D that's going on and bring it and understand the local practice of it or the local use of it, you have a good combination. But collaboration is a lot of work. We actually have a team member that is specifically what she does is handle the collaboration.
Okay, great. Alice, I just wondered, from your review of all the case studies, maybe you could tell us a bit about what you think are the common attributes of successful partnerships.
Just a couple points in building off of what Rebecca was just talking about, especially on that last point about having someone who's tasked with holding those relationships within an organization was key. We also called this the translation capacity in the report, the ability for someone within a humanitarian organization or a partner organization to quote-unquote translate across the different sectors that are being combined in order to bring about the innovation. The classic example of this is the tech sector. So there were several cases where there were key challenges faced in that partnership where the humanitarians and and the techies were speaking completely different languages, and someone from the humanitarian organization's IT department had to be brought in to kind of be peacemaker on a couple of instances. So having that translation capacity, but perhaps more broadly the ability to empathize, because there were also partnerships we saw where they said, the key success factor here in our partnership is that I happen to, I work at a university or I work at a private sector organization, but I used to work in the field, so I understand what the humanitarian context is like, and I can see it from both angles. And then also trying to think about diffusion. I think that's the other thing with partnerships. It's so broad. You can have partnerships for development of an innovation, but you can also have partnerships for diffusion. And if you're looking at partnership for diffusion, it's really important to have those conversations as early as possible. So if you're partnering with the private sector, and the idea for diffusion is that the humanitarian organization will give the innovation over to the private sector and they'll commercialize it, and that's the diffusion plan. Having those agreements in place early on is really crucial. If your diffusion plan is to diffuse through interventions through humanitarian organizations, making sure that they work your innovation into their deployment plans is really critical, so you can actually deploy it once it has a working, proved prototype. So talking about diffusion as early as possible is really helpful for utilizing that partnership in the best way.
Great.
Can I add a point?
Yeah, sure.
I think it's really fascinating that working with private and humanitarian sector, I think there are a group of the tech world who's very interested in learning from the humanitarian sector as to what needs are. And a lot of times we think, we've got to get from them what they know, what their learnings are, da 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 da. I mean, we had an example where we worked with Microsoft to build a machine translation engine for Swahili, which had never been done. And it was really through our work and the humanitarian need for that engine that drew their involvement in it. And in fact, it became the first African language that they released in machine translation. And that was fully because we really were engaged from a humanitarian standpoint on making sure that Swahili became one of the main languages. So I think it goes both ways, and it's a win-win, and I think that it's something that should be looked at more.
Thank you. Kim, did you have anything to add to that based on
Yeah,
your experience?
I think this is something that's really important to us. For ELRA, partnerships are the heart of what we're trying to do. And it's interesting in the HIF, we've never had a requirement that applications have some form of partnership, yet it's the overwhelming majority of the ideas that end up getting funding can demonstrate a partnership, and often the most promising ones are where it's humanitarians linking out to the private sector or to academia. The only thing I'd add is that I think where they work best, it's where you may have a shared problem, and in the humanitarian system there's some really compelling problems, but the goals of different partner organizations will often be very different. So if you've got a humanitarian organization partnering with a credit card company to deliver cash through payment cards in a hard-to-reach area, very compelling problem, but the goals of those two organizations are very different, and it's important to recognize that for the partnership to work well. And it doesn't preclude partnership, and it doesn't preclude working together, but I think a frank recognition of that is really important, and also that those partnerships have to be sustained over the long term for them to be most beneficial.
Yeah, no, very important point. Jamila, in your current role at IFRC, I mean, what's IFRC doing to sort of ensure that you're working more with non-traditional actors, for lack of a better term, including the private sector, to harness innovation?
Well, first of all, the foundation of how we work as a federation is actually partnership. So let me talk about from the micro level of within our organization, and at the bigger level with other partners. So, trying to create a culture of innovation. We're trying to start within our federation itself, which has 190 national societies and 17 million volunteers. This is how we work. So we've done something quite interesting called randomized coffee trials. I just want to share that with you because it's very exciting. So in 4 languages, bringing 1,000 volunteers from 80 countries and just connecting. I think part of partnership is really making sure people connect and connecting them through Skype and so forth, having conversations, no records, no reports, nothing, but just connecting in 4 different languages, and has resulted in some relationships building into some really good innovative practices. And it actually, to our surprise, won the Federation an award. I have to remember it's a Global Employee Engagement Award, just by connecting people through this randomized. Basically, they have a coffee in their hand, they have this chat on Skype. So the second thing that we've done is actually, we have very interesting partnerships, say, with Airbus. And, Airbus as well as the space program in Airbus. So what we've done is a two-way thing. One is we present to them a bunch of, operational problems from, process design, from, water sanitation, flat packs to, health, problems that we have. How do we solve this? So they bring their bunch of scientists, very young, dynamic people to look at our problems and then go away, think about it, and come back and tell us, what they think might be able to be done. The second thing they do is they bring their ideas, their space containment labs, and tell us how then you then use this in the humanitarian setting, for example, in Ebola isolation and containment and so forth. So it's a really two-way relationship and actually sharing with each other, here's what we do, and here are the challenges, and then them saying, here's what we do. Are these things actually useful to mankind? Will this be useful to people out there? And then really having these conversations. Of course, there are many other things we're doing. We're actually embarking on an innovation journey. Well, surprise, surprise, innovations under my portfolio. So we are starting now to really look at how we expand our innovation network, having a broad group of advisory, a group from local organizations to affected people. We've already approached a couple of you in this room to really bringing, some different range of ideas around the table and helping us, how do we tap into this rich network? When I first learned there were 17 million volunteers actually out there doing stuff, and I was so dumbfounded, right? But the potential of then us offering to all of you who are doing innovation, our outreach to local communities, to people. If you want us to gather the problems that need to be solved, we can do this. And this is how we can form a partnership with all of you as well.
And Jamila, also, while you have the floor, I wanted to ask you about responsible risk-taking. So this is an issue in innovation, of course. What do you think are the ethical issues that are relevant to humanitarian innovation, and how can organizations address these responsibly?
Yeah. I think, first of all, as in my new role as Federation, obviously humanitarian principles are important: impartiality, independence. Anything that we do, it has to be really principled. The second thing, I think, keep it simple: do no harm. I think make sure that in whatever we're doing, there is no harm to the people we're actually trying to do it for. And the third thing is, there are so many ethical frameworks, particularly in the R&D world, as mentioned by Rebecca. I think we've got to look at that as well. I think that the challenge we have in innovation is that innovation has become, it should become a means to achieve something, not the ends. I think that's the real risk I think we face, that everybody wants to innovate for the sake of innovation rather than innovation to really end the problem. So in our journey to do that, and it's exciting, as people who make a whole living out of innovation now, but, to really keep in mind the end point, which is people affected by crisis, people who are trying to improve their lives, and ensuring that we don't harm them and don't damage the rest of whatever people are doing in the sector through some innovative practice that is unethical.
Thank you. Alice, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think, building on what Jamila was talking about with harm and risk, so I think there's sometimes this absence of asking who's going to bear the additional risk that's created through innovation. But as I mentioned in my talk earlier, it's about identifying those key stakeholders and trying to mitigate risks as you go along. I think also picking up on the points that Jamila and Kim have raised about making innovation more affected, more centered on the affected person and really driven by affected people is a key way to ensure ethics. But also looking at harm, and not just the harm that could potentially be brought about through an innovation process, but also looking at the harm of not innovating and by getting better evidence about how our current interventions are performing. So really being able to draw that kind of comparative picture is important. I think we tend to think in the humanitarian sector that we do harm by doing positive activities, but we can actually do harm by not doing, by through inaction, right? So.
Can I add something,
Sure.
Wendy, on risk? when we speak to donors or organizations and talk about risk management and about a risk appetite, I often say, well, if before you actually say that, what risk are you willing to take as a leader in your own environment? I think we need to question ourselves as well, and our own practices. So if I was, one of the things I've been saying to my teams in my new job is that I need you to keep a failure diary. I need you to try and push yourself to do something different within limits. And if you don't get it right, write it down, what you learn from it and how you can do things better. And I want to celebrate the best failure that you achieve it as a group, because I think unless you demonstrate in your leadership that you're willing to allow people to make mistakes and not to have punitive action, but rather a learning environment that will generate much more innovation, I think that's required. And speaking to some donors, I've pushed some of them to say, well, what is your risk tolerance? Make it clear to us. If you want us to innovate, tell us how much your risk tolerance is, so that we will be able to work within those limits as well.
Thank you. Kim, did you have a comment?
Yeah, this is a really challenging area, but also one that we take very seriously. And I think there's a challenge. There are established frameworks when you're managing risks in formal research projects, and if we're working with universities and humanitarians, they'll have systems and processes for managing that and getting ethical review. But I think the tendency can be just to try and extend those processes into humanitarian organizations, and then that can be challenging and disempowering to those people who are trying to solve problems at the field level. So there are established principles, and there are the frameworks around do no harm and so on. But I think, as Alice was alluding to, there's this sort of paradox where we're often holding our innovation activities to a higher ethical and risk standard than we would our normal practices, because there's so many interventions that organizations do that they either don't know really the impact of and the effects of, or in some cases actually have negative externalities but continue to do. And so I think we need to look at it in the round and really understand how agencies can get better at collecting evidence about what they're doing and using that to continually improve their performance. But when they do that, to not outsource the risks onto affected people or onto individual staff members, but look at ways to manage it more proactively.
Thanks. And Rebecca, briefly, if you want to comment.
The harm of not innovating is I think it's huge. I mean, it's we as an organization, we could have never gone into crisis relief because we do an enormous amount of work in development work every single day, and we could completely have, We did put the network aside for 2 years because we were so worried about whether we could make it work. But we had to try it. We had to innovate. We had to take that risk. And I can't say enough about how HIF gave us that freedom and that flexibility to figure that out, because we did not know initially. We had a lot of evidence. We had a lot of discussions. We had a lot of collaboration. But we needed to, we were doing harm by not innovating. We were, we couldn't let Haiti happen again. And that was my big fear. Having, being the chief person involved and knowing that was around the corner. And if we didn't innovate, that's going to happen again. And so to be able to innovate and to have the flexibility and then to adapt it to Nepal and adapt it to West Africa, I mean, that's critical.
Thanks, Rebecca. Now, last question before we open it up to our audiences, and I'm going to direct this to you, Jamila. Partly because of your previous involvement with the WHS. So we know that innovation was one of the 4 key themes, is one of the 4 key themes for the WHS consultation process. And now we're just 1 month away from the summit. But it seems that the commitments and proposals on innovation are focused mainly on public-private partnership and enhancing the role of private sector philanthropy and humanitarian innovation. So how do you think we can maintain the focus on affected people's involvement in innovation? I mean, you started to talk about this a little bit earlier. How do we take into account their views
Yeah.
as innovators?
This is a tough question, right? Because I'm guilty of the innovation work in WHS. I think that, as I mentioned before, I think this innovation itself, in my opinion, shouldn't be a standalone. Okay, it should be cross-cutting. I think what the World Humanitarian Summit process has done is brought innovation to a level of a global discussion. But it hasn't really been able to address a lot of the community innovation because maybe the people around the table who discuss innovation weren't the right people. This is my own personal reflection, not as a criticism, but because you can't get those discussions in large groups. I think but to remind myself that it did kickstart a much wider discussion on innovation itself. So I think that in itself is a huge bonus. And also don't forget the summit is a 2-day event. Okay, it's what happens after the summit that's important. How do we keep the momentum on the discussions on innovation? How do we and to be honest, in all the discussions on innovation during the process of the summit, it was really a strong call towards going local as possible and trying to understand. And it's not easy.
No.
If it was easy, then even HIF would have been able to do many more local. And we struggled with this, and let's be honest, right? Every meeting that we had on the ground panel, we were saying, why can't we get, these innovations, requests from local organizations? But because they're not built to write proposals the way we design, some of the things that we design at a global level. Local organizations don't think like global organizations. So I would take it, in my truly optimistic nature that, I think we've got the ball rolling. We've got to keep engaging. We've got to now go down to the local communities. I'm offering the Federation as this platform for anybody who wants to engage with us. We are extremely committed now to take innovation, to the communities and from the communities, more importantly from the communities and learning. And I think, this report, further engagements, further interactions with all the different people in this room will be critical. I think we've got to keep learning. We have to have, our minds open and keep pushing ourselves to go further and actually how we go, to the root cause.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm now going to open the floor to the audience. Oh, and John's got his hand up already. Questions for I know, it was inevitable. Yeah. Question. Yes, and I'm going to take questions in batches of 3 or 4, and we've got several already from our online audience as well. So if you could just say, even if I might know you, who you are and what your affiliation is.